So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the next instalment in our recent webinar series, which has been running from August and we'll be running, I think we've got sessions each month all the way through to March. And today's session, we'll be talking about how you might be able to create a culture of privacy in your organization. So in terms of the overall kind of objective of what we're going to be talking about today, myself and the panel, is essentially how to better understand how we can develop a culture of data privacy driven by behaviors in your organization, as opposed to just seeing it as a compliance exercise and just adhering to the rules of the GDPR, for example, and not really going any further than that in terms of embedding it into your working practice. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on 5 key areas today. So we're going to talk about how to actually define privacy, both privacy as a word in its own sense, and also in terms of data privacy. We're going to talk about business culture, because that's really important in terms of everything we're going to be talking about today. We'll take a bit of a snapshot of data privacy in 2023 in terms of how you might be viewing privacy and data privacy, and your customers, more importantly. And then take a bit of a deep dive into how we might develop and deliver core values in your organization. And finally, we're going to talk about the power of conversations and meetings and how important meetings are in terms of actually setting the scene for all of the kind of points we're talking about today, in particular about how we might develop a culture of privacy. I'm joined today by my colleague, Meagan Mirza, both of us from ClearComm, and also the wonderful Bob Harper from Agendali, who is a new panelist on the ClearComm and More Kingston Smith webinars. Welcome, Bob. Would you be able to maybe just give us a bit of an overview of your background and what you might be sort of bringing to the table today? You're on mute, Bob, sorry.
Didn't want to hear you coughing. I'm going to hear me coughing earlier. Yeah, my background is I'm an accountant, former accountant, moved into the software industry about 25 years ago. I trained with Pricewaterhouse, run my own practice, was a marketing director of a small firm, high street firm. So, and I've worked, I suppose, over the last 20 years with maybe 300 firms of different sizes in different capacities, helping them mainly in marketing and sales, but most recently through meetings with our new platform, Agendali, with culture and productivity.
Fantastic, thanks, Bob. And it's going to be really interesting to get your insight when we get to talking about the power of conversations, because I know you've got some fantastic insights to draw upon it. But we'll start up through defining privacy, because I think it's really important in these webinars that we don't just assume from the outset that we all understand what the key definitions are. Meagan, I'll invite you to jump in at any time on this one, because as a data protection officer of great experience, this is your field. But essentially, privacy is the right to be left alone, or the freedom from interference and intrusion. And it's all about the respect that you might expect in terms of to be free from public attention. And then when we drill down into data privacy, it's about you, the public, your customers, society as a whole, to have rights and control over your personal data. And for organizations and businesses like ours that are processing and collecting that data, to be focused on that in terms of the governance of it. And obviously at this point, we're talking about legislation, Meagan, aren't we? But I think in terms of someone who has a background with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, there are consequences, aren't there, for those who maybe don't focus on privacy on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. And yeah, as Rich touched on, I spent 12 years working at the Information Commissioner's Office before moving into this area. And where we saw and continue to see sort of significant issues, it's not just about breaches. Of course, they get the publicity and potential fines, but often publicity comes with an audit. So the ICO can come out and do an audit of your organization, and they will publish an executive summary of that audit. And that's where you see organizations falling down where they haven't got the right frameworks in place, and the culture sort of piece is missing from the ones that don't come out well from audit. So it's the reputational risk that goes with that. Obviously the fines, as I said, are publicized, but certainly with those, the audits and any publicity around poor practices can have a significant impact, particularly on smaller organizations, because you are really relying on customer trust to continue to engage with you as a small business. And the minute someone knows that something's not quite right, they'll just go to another organization that does the same thing. So that trust and reputation is really important, and it's not just about the fines, it's getting it right all through your organization, from board level down to your operational teams.
Yeah, and it's fair to say, I think from our experience, that there are organizations that in 2018 would have put together all of the documents and policies that they felt they needed to have, and that is essentially what they've done in respect of data privacy, and so they don't necessarily live and breathe it or think about it on a day-to-day basis. They've perceived it as a tick box exercise, haven't they? And that's very much at the core of what we're talking about today, I think.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And it's more about commitment rather than a tick box compliance exercise. So commitment's a really important point there.
So again, your area. So in terms of defining data privacy, obviously the GDPR is what's going to be on everyone's lips when they think about data privacy. And quite often when we're talking to clients or potential clients or any organization, they will refer to data privacy as the GDPR. So they kind of conflate the two, don't they? And that's a little bit like thinking of an MOT as everything about driving. It's really not. And so we're keeping it basic. We're not going deep on the GDPR today. But if you could maybe talk us through this, Meagan, in terms of what this actually means.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and some of the definitions within the legislation are quite dense in terms of trying to understand it, but just put it simply, personal data is around the information that you might hold as an organization that distinguishes one person from another person. So in most cases, it's going to be their contact details. It could be more detailed than that. It could be health data. It could be anything around ethnicity or anything like that. But it's essentially information that you hold that you're able to distinguish, as I said, one person from another. And it is called personal data in the UK. We have personally identifiable information in the northern sort of American states. So we see variations of this, but essentially across all the countries that have some sort of data protection legislation in place, it is around those identifiers that tell you that you're dealing with an individual and making that a difference to the other individuals you might be dealing with. Just on the back of that, I think most organizations in the UK are going to be handling personal data in some shape or form, whether it's just your HR function or whether it's wider than that. So really all organizations need to be alert to this legislation and what the requirements are.
Yeah, and I know, Bob, as a business owner, this is something very much sort of at the front of your mind. And I think the takeaway from today is that privacy should be a core focus of every organization, central to their culture. And I know from Meagan and my experience that it's much smoother and easier for an organization to adopt it earlier and to focus on it in depth. So, and it all leads into business culture. Great quote there from Forbes in terms of what culture actually is, because I think if you were to ask 100 different people in business what culture is, it might mean slightly different things to them, but essentially that's the kind of summary of what culture is in business. And we're going to talk about core values today, but essentially culture is a set of core values and practices, and it defines the organization both internally for the people that work within it and externally in terms of how it's perceived. It's also a way to set your organization apart from others and to potentially gain commercial advantage, and it's the way the employees function within the workplace and how the public perceives your organization. I mean, Bob, that'd be good to know, good to hear your thoughts on culture. I mean, in terms of what does company culture mean to you, and what might a good culture look like?
Well, as I was just listening to you there, when I talk about culture, I think it's a huge opportunity. Very, very difficult to get a true competitive advantage and unfair competitive advantage. And I think culture is one of the things that can do that. So by that, I mean, to get an advantage, it's not something that someone can go and buy or replicate very easy. Because if somebody can go and buy the same software that you're using, or replicate, your marketing strategies or whatever you're doing, that's not a competitive advantage. When you build something that's difficult to build, which is culture, it's not easy to build a great culture, but that can give you a competitive advantage. That's my sort of first thought. And what does a good culture look like? I think that's a difficult one, because there isn't one definition of a good culture. It's what's right for that business. As long as I think a good culture is one that is intentional, whatever you want it to be. So there's lots of different businesses that are run in different ways with different cultures. It's just how intentional or authentic it is, I suppose.
Yeah. Do you think that I'm going to word this? So is it essential in order to if you want to begin a journey of evolving your culture to where you want it to be, that has to start from the top, or is it more of a kind of flat structure? How important is the leader in that context?
Meagan, you used the word commitment, didn't you, a while ago? Commitment, you used that word.
Yeah,
I think commitment's a really important word in terms of values, because you're going to make some decisions and take actions. Otherwise, the values don't mean anything. So the leaders need to be committed to it. And then there's a couple of different ways of defining the values. One option is the leader or leaders define the action, define those values. And that's one approach. The other approach is to find people in the organization that sort of, you just look at them. I used to use this analogy, but there's a lady that I used to work with in this firm of high street accountants. And I used to say to the MD, if you cut her in half, she'd have like a stick of rock. She'd have the name of the company inside her, right? That's when you know that she really is 100. She's exactly what you want everyone. Everything she does, the way she behaved, that's what we want. So now she was not a fee earner in that firm of accountants. She was one of the support team, but I would have built the culture around her, not necessarily one of your superstars that are generating loads of fees. So yeah, that's sort of how I would go about it.
Thanks, Bob. That's good. So some useful insights here that I thought would be worth sharing today. So and there's lots of stats that I left out because I'm conscious we don't want too many slides. But so nearly 90% of employees believe a strong company culture is key to business success, which is really interesting because, again, as Bob alluded to there, in the way that you can't define culture, I suppose it's also different ways to define success, isn't there? Because success is different for different organizations, but that's a really interesting one. But it does link to revenue growth. So from the Harvard Business Review, we see that there's a 4 times increase in revenue growth for companies against companies with a weak culture and shared purposes and values. And this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I know you would be too, is shared purpose and values. They see an increase in performance compared to teams without it. Again, nearly 80% of companies failed to transform due to poor engagement with employees, and we're going to talk about engagement when we ask Bob to go a deep dive into the meeting best practice and conversations. And also more research suggesting that company culture is valued by employees above career opportunities, work-life balance, and even the compensation and benefits. So I'd invite both of you to kind of sort of to share some thoughts on that, because I think there's some really powerful stats there, especially in terms of from within the employee view of how important culture is to them and also the success of the business.
Certainly from my experience, and I'm not just talking about data protection, but certainly looking at it through that prism. And it starts from the minute someone walks through your door as a new employee. The induction piece and how you manage that is so important in terms of building that mindset right from the outset and what is expected of them and what the mission and vision is in terms of that particular organization. And these organizations, if they get it right in terms of data protection, in terms of cyber, in terms of all the other things they have to deal with, this is where you get employees, wanting to work for that organization, not just there for the sake of it. So it's, as I said, it's like the life cycle of data, isn't it? You start right at the point that they enter the organization, the training that you do, and that repetitive training as well. So repeating it every 12 months, refresher training, and all the learning and development opportunities that you give to people is all part of this culture. And if that's not right, this is where organizations fall down. This is where we see the serious incidents, the breaches, the failing the audits, all that sort of stuff. So it's really that getting the basics right, that underpinning framework is vitally important for any organization, no matter what size.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, actually, as you were talking, what's the impact then? And you've kind of answered it, but it'd be good to build on it. What's the impact if privacy is not central to a company's culture? It kind of goes that direction you've just alluded to, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly goes south. And when something goes wrong, it can be worse because no one knows what to do. No one knows how to handle it. There's no reporting mechanism to senior levels. Everyone runs around in a panic. Whereas if you've got that framework in place, the incident may well still happen, but you will handle it better and there will be better outcomes, and you can still have that trust and engagement with the people that you deal with. So getting it right is a way of reducing risks of incidents and breaches, but also better managing stuff when it goes wrong, because stuff does go wrong, and it will do for every organization.
I think I just sort of, before I ask Bob to sort of chip in, I think my experience with the background in manufacturing is that there's a good example here with lean manufacturing. The belief stat is that you need about 80% buy-in, so true buy-in from the staff to actually start to see the results of that sort of cultural shift. And I think that's a really good example, because it's the same with privacy. You can't just rely on allocating privacy or data protection to one person or a small team. It has to be something that everyone in the business or organization lives and breathes, doesn't it? And like you said then, if something does go wrong, the chances that it's going to be managed better are hugely improved by the fact that you can rely on pretty much everyone in the organization knows what to do. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on these sorts of numbers, Bob, and sort of experiences.
Yeah, so success, like you said, that's different people define it different ways. If we're talking about small businesses, not reporting into stock markets and what have you, then perhaps its choice is success, because you can choose which customers to work with, choose what to do, who not to do it with. If you've got that strength, that power as a brand, as a business, and I think culture is a massive part of achieving that. I just wrote a couple of notes down for me. Having been an employee and also employed people, what I like to give and like to get is discretionary effort. So it's not just coming to the job to do the tasks, to do the projects, and then to go home. There is a feeling that there's something else that you're doing it for, and that's the purpose. I use an example of a denim company, a jeans company in North Wales, and they set that business up because, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, they moved the manufacturing of jeans out of that town to, I think it was Malta. Marks and Spencer's did it, and 400 people lost their jobs. And the guy that set this business up, the purpose of this business is to get 400 jobs back for the local community. Now, that for me is like, it sort of hairs on the back of my neck stand up, because there is a real tangible purpose. So when people go to work producing jeans, right, the high quality, expensive jeans, there's a reason, more than making money, way more than more than making people happy with jeans. There's a meaningful purpose that they buy into. So everything that they do is going to be done with more effort, with more discretion, with more care. And whether that's sewing the jeans or packaging them up or doing the Facebook advert, or looking after privacy and data, everything's going to be done to a higher standard. So that's sort of, for me, the impact of culture is, if you've got two businesses and one's got this culture thing right and one hasn't, the one that's got the culture thing right is going to perform better over the long term, even if the other one's got a competitive advantage at the beginning. It's just this power, this engine in the business.
So with that business as an example, then I'm guessing that because that culture is positive and strong from the outset, when you want to introduce a different or a new focus, or to to increase the focus on data privacy, for example, it would be a much easier journey because you have that in place.
I mean, you could frame it. We've got this mission to get these 400 jobs back. We've got 150 of them, right? We need to go and get, another 250. I hope I've done my maths right there, right? So, and one of the things that's going to help us all, one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we don't trip up along the way. And one of the things we can trip up on is data privacy. And we're going to put a few things in place to make sure that we don't get held up by this. Some of the competition might not be as good at us at looking after data. So that's how you can frame it, linking everything back to the purpose and making sure that the core values are there with the behaviors underneath, so people know what they've got to do. So they're not looking after data for data reasons. They're looking after data to get the 400 jobs.
Yeah, got you. So a couple of thoughts then. Very much sort of delving into our personal experiences. I'd be really interested how culture might have impacted your experiences with an organization. I'm guessing good or bad. Yeah, so either of you really. I mean, I've got some thoughts as well, but yeah, I'd be interested to know what sort of experiences you've been through.
So oh, sorry, Bob. I was just, from my perspective, I'm often going into organizations where something's probably gone wrong. But it is the difference between an organization that has a really good culture in terms of how they come out on the back of that, as opposed to someone that really just doesn't care about its employees or the fact that something's gone wrong. So where I've seen examples of really strong organizations, and it doesn't matter what size, it could be, a 2-3 man band, or it could be, a big government department. It's the senior leadership buy-in that is so important. It's that accountability principle that runs through data protection, where you have to demonstrate how you comply. They have, a good organization will have networks set up around champions, if you want to call them that, around data protection, cyber, whatever. They will have a senior responsible person. And often when you go in to speak to that senior person, whether it be the chief exec or whoever that might be, it's their approach and how that dribbles down through the organization is so important ultimately, and that buy-in that you get from staff, that commitment, and that's the organizations that do well, and they have trust with the people they deal with externally, etc. Then you get the organizations where the senior people sort of just delegate stuff downwards. They don't really have oversight. There's no governance in place. And things will and do go wrong, and staff churn is, you see that a lot in these type of organizations. So there's no sort of impetus to stay longer than maybe a couple of years. Then you have issues with disgruntled staff, and that brings with it another sort of risk area. So it's that, as I said, that it's having that framework in place, the buy-in of staff, the commitment of your senior teams, and making sure you've got that framework in place that underpins everything that you do around data. That's the perspective I'm coming from. But Bob, you might have other sort of things to add on the back of that. You're on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't come at it always through the lens of data and privacy. That's not my first thought. My sort of first thought is like this success, it's growth, it's sales, marketing, growing a business. That's my first thought. So the impact that I've experienced being in a company with a really poor culture. I was talking to Rich before we started this call today, and I think there's one thing worse than not having core values, and that's having them and actually not following them through. Right? That's the worst thing. And I've been in a business where that was definitely the case, and it's really painful. That's the word I would thought about it before. It's really painful for the leadership team, for the owner of the business. It's really painful for everybody else, and you just there's a lack of trust, is a word that you use, Meagan. The trust. When you've got a culture, you can trust people. You know, even if you make a mistake, or even if you're not sure about something, you're happy to open up. And when people start opening up, communication happens. People trust each other. Without trust, you can't really move forward as a team, because you don't know, are they going to be there for you? And if it goes wrong, are you going to be like on the chopping block straight away? So you need that trust. And I've worked, as I said, I've worked with hundreds of accounting firms with different products, and the ones that have the best culture always succeed at implementing new change things better, because they're sort of, they're on board. They're on board with it. They're open, and they know if they make a mistake, it's not going to go wrong. I don't know, it might go wrong, but they're not going to get in trouble. And yeah, they're happy to try things. They're happy to try new things, even if they fail. That's no big deal. Not everything I've sold over the years has worked, but most of it has. But those that don't, it's not that our product didn't work; they didn't make it work. Because if you, and that's, most software that gets sold, whatever industry you're in, it works in other businesses. So it's not the software; it's usually the business that isn't good enough to adopt it.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that if sort of taking it down to its simple level is, when it comes to decisions, like really important decisions in the business, if you're always thinking about why, and why are we doing what we do, and also, and I know Bob and I have talked about this before, the phrase "do the right thing," and if you've always got that phrase in your mind, "do the right thing," then I think that it just proves then that culture really, even though it's quite intangible and subjective in some ways, is actually the foundation of a business. And if your culture is strong, then your foundation is strong, and everything else that's built upon it is probably more likely to be successful. Do you think?
I agree. I think we're going to talk about this later, about stories, because when you use a phrase like "do the right thing," which I love that phrase, it needs to be defined, because what you think is doing the right thing might be different to me.
Yeah.
And that gap, that expectation gap, can be really frustrating for businesses that want to build this intentional culture, but it doesn't quite happen. And they why not? Why don't they get it? Well, it's because it's not been explained well enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so this is a huge question. I don't expect us to answer this, and we've got lots of other stuff to cover. But how would we go about building a culture from scratch if it's a new business, for instance, or evolving a culture that's flawed or could be improved? And like I said, we'd go down a very deep rabbit hole on this one, but I'd be interested in a couple of sort of sound bites on this one that would be useful.
I got a sound bite for you.
Go on.
I heard this years ago, and it stuck with me. So it's not, I didn't make it up. And in fact, I don't make anything up. I just beg, borrow, and steal ideas and regurgitate them. So you find and refine your words, your values. You haven't got to create them. You've got to find them. So going back to the lady I mentioned in this high street firm, they're inside her. We need to dig and find these values, these words that articulate, and use words. I'm sort of quite really down to earth. As a professional accountant, I know my language isn't like some other people's. I'm really down to earth, so I might use language that other people might find it doesn't sort of fit with them very well, and I'm cool with that, because I'm me, and I have to use the language that I use. And if you don't like that language, you're probably not going to like me, and it's probably best we don't work together, because it's always going to not feel right. So be really authentic, and dig and find the words and reflect on them on a regular basis. Are these the right words? Have we used the right stories to articulate them? That's really going to help you build and evolve the culture.
Okay, that's really helpful. So let's have a bit of a snapshot of data privacy in 2023, and I know that Meagan and I touched on this in much greater depth back in August, and that webinar is still available on the Moore Kingston Smith website or on our YouTube channel. So please take a look at that, because it really does take a deep dive. However, by way of a snapshot, so in 2018 we had the GDPR was in media probably pretty much from the beginning of the year, sort of January time, I noticed that, a steep peak of interest in what was this thing, the GDPR, that was going to affect everybody from late May of that year. Data protection and privacy itself became a common media theme for a short period. And when I say a short period, I think probably in the months preceding May 2018, and then maybe 6 months afterwards. And then once we got to 2019, maybe not quite so much. And then in 2020, obviously we had a far bigger sort of headline with COVID, and that in itself has had effects on data privacy and definitely cybersecurity. And also a huge focus where everyone was talking about consent as a lawful basis for processing personal data, people rushing and businesses rushing to create policy documents, and a fear of ICO fines, to where we are today. And I'll ask Meagan's sort of comment in a moment, but I think where we are today is pretty much that data privacy is still not yet a core focus in most organizations, and very few could claim to have a genuine privacy-focused culture and embedded it in their core values. So I'd be interested in Meagan's thoughts on what that scene looked like in 2018 and how that evolved, and then specifically what the implications are when privacy is not embedded into an organization's culture. Although I think in some ways we've covered this previously already today, but I'd be really interested.
Sure. I mean, I was on the build team at the ICO when the legislation was coming into play, and there was obviously then on top of that the Data Protection Act for the UK, and it was chaos in terms of the organisations that were contacting the ICO through the helpline, needing advice, particularly small to medium organisations that really were limited in terms of resource. They couldn't afford a data protection advisor or officer, and they are really struggling to get their head around what is actually quite complex legislation. I'm like Bob, very much keep it simple. So, and that was certainly the approach at the ICO, and there was a lot of guidance produced specifically for small, medium organizations in very sort of basic terms, and not having to read through swathes of documents, etc., to get to a fairly compliant state in terms of the mandatory requirements of the legislation. Moving on 5 years, yes, I think it's probably fair to say most organizations are on board in terms of having something in place. But through my experience, I often go in and, there'll be out of date policies. There's no sort of culture around this, because I always talk about a culture of transparency. You want people to be exactly like Bob was saying previously. You want people to be engaged and talking to each other. And if there's an incident, you want that reported straight away, not hidden, that type of thing. So there's still work to do. I'll often go into an organization and they'll have old policies that were drafted at pace in 2018 and they haven't been looked at again. That, and if you talk to staff at the front end of the organization, they have no idea what you're talking about. They'll look blankly at you. So if the ICO came in to do an audit, they tend to focus on front end staff, and actually that's where they get a sense of what the culture in an organization is like. So they'll expect front end staff to know where the policies are, in terms of their systems and where they hold them. What do you do if something goes wrong? What happens if you send an email to the wrong address at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon? What do you do? Really basic stuff, but that is missing in a lot of organizations. It's that holistic piece around culture that there are still challenges there in terms of getting that right.
We've had a really good question, which I think is worth asking now. So thank you for this one. So there's someone who's wondering whether, and we have kind of answered this in the webinar in great depth actually in August, but it's worth touching on now, asking whether the GDPR is more focused on bigger organizations like your Facebooks and Googles of the world, is the first part of the question, and has the ICO find any smaller companies? And so in the August webinar, we have a couple of slides which demonstrate who and what kind of fines or financial penalties the ICO has issued. But Meagan, it'd be great if you could sort of, I know exactly what we're going to say in terms of the GDPR and whether it's focused on bigger organizations.
So a lot of the publicity around it is probably what you see in terms of the bigger organizations, because they're getting the massive big fines and stuff like that. But actually, no, it applies equally across any organization, no matter what the size, if you are processing personal data. But it is a risk-based approach as well. And often that will be, that will be the size of the organization, your risk appetite and all the rest of it in terms of your approach. But broadly speaking, the mandatory requirements of the legislation will apply to you, a smaller organization, as it would to a big one like Meta, for example. There are some exemptions there for smaller organizations, so you may not need to do something to the extent that you would have to do if you were a big organization. So some of the records keeping sort of requirements are lesser if you're a smaller organization. But broadly speaking, yes, it's similar for both. Fines, yes, the charities have been fined, smaller organizations have been fined. If you look at the ICO website in terms of audits, all different shapes and sizes of organizations have been audited, and they're quite helpful to look at in terms of, learning how not to do it, in terms of the ones that haven't come out very well. So it is equal in terms of what you're required to do, but there are some exemptions there for smaller organizations.
Yeah. Worth mentioning, isn't it, that obviously we're talking about financial penalties, but also the ICO issues reprimands, and they are all published publicly on the ICO's website. So the reputational damage that comes with that is quite extreme, and that's something that from the outset I think was kind of apparent, that yes, you might be fined a certain amount of money, but what prolonged lasting damage comes with it is definitely something to think about. And some people will kind of say and think that the reputational damage is more damaging in the long term. So in terms of your customers, everyone who's on the call today, and their personal data, from a survey in 2021, nearly 90% of consumers care about data privacy and they want more control. And then some really interesting stats. So this kind of, we've got 5 bullet points here, but they all kind of say the same thing in terms of a common theme. So feelings about loss of control over our personal data, feeling that personal data is less secure now than it was 5 years ago. Only 6% feel their data is more secure than it was in the past. 50% nearly, don't believe they can adequately protect their data today, and 64%, this is interesting, would blame the company, not the hacker, for the loss of their personal data as a result of a cyber attack. Now, it's interesting because the stats are perceptive. So we have to factor in that during COVID and since COVID, cybercrime has become more prolific. We have and one of the questions that we've had, which I haven't sort of mentioned so far, was about home working and the impact of remote workforce on culture. But remote working has also impacted on this kind of stuff in terms of increased breaches. There's much more media focus on a breach and a cyber attack now than there would have been. So that whole has to be factored in. But yeah, I mean, Bob, as a consumer, are you confident that your personal data is safe with the third parties you trust it with?
No, because there's so much, there's so much out there going on. Yeah, I suspect some of my data is already where it shouldn't be, where I don't want it to be.
Yeah.
That's
most likely.
I've not yet had knowledge of that or the implications of it, and I hope I never do. But
no. Okay, so just I'm conscious of our path at the moment. So this one always really intrigues me, because this isn't just about privacy, but when we think about, we're talking about culture, we're talking about legislation in the same spectrum, really. So any thoughts and experiences in relation to any instance where legislation or a law has actually changed behaviors or changed culture? And does making something illegal change behaviors ultimately, or is it just, does it, I'd be really interested in that. I'm thinking about sort of wearing seatbelts and health and safety in workplaces. It takes decades, doesn't it, I think, to change societal behaviors?
Yeah, I'm thinking about speeding. That's a great question. And being transparent,
so that's an interesting one.
Being transparent and open and honest. I have been done for speeding.
Yeah.
And what happens? You get a choice, don't you, of the points, or you go on a course. And I think most people choose the course. And I found it excellent, really interesting, and that education was the thing that changes my behaviour.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a long time since I did my test. I don't go around driving crazy fast, but I do, and have at times exceeded the speed limit. But I'm much, having been on that course, which was a few years ago. It stuck with me. I'm far more conscious of my behaviour there.
Yeah. The thought I take away from this, and the second question I think we'll skip because Meagan's brilliantly answered it already, I think, in different ways, is, you know, do we drive within the speed limit because we know there's a speed camera there, or do we do it for do the right thing? That's, yeah. So it's interesting how it will be really interesting at 5 years into the UK GDPR, in 10 years and 15 years, whether we start to see genuine change. So core values, essential to building a privacy culture. I won't read through the bullet points there, but a really interesting quote from Steve Jobs, and very much a case of core values being central to them, even as they grew. He was conscious that those core values shouldn't slide. I'm definitely a big believer myself that core values, if they're right for your organization, would support ethical decision making every day. So a couple of quick thoughts on that would be good.
We're talking about, sorry, go on,
go
Meagan.
on.
No, you go first.
All right, it's just a quick one, really. Where I've gone into organizations where there has been a fantastic sort of culture and privacy sort of central to everything they do, as well as cyber and all the other important things that, you know, organizations have to comply with as well, where you sort of the starting point is a mission and sort of vision statement. And you can see that in the big sort of, you know, multi-global organizations that we deal with daily. You know, you'll look at their mission and vision statements, and you know, they just capture it in, you know, a few words in terms of what their organization is about. And that's where that feeds through that culture. But as I have said, it has to come from the top, from my perspective, particularly around data protection. If you don't have that senior level buy-in and accountability there, it just gets lost. There's no governance. There's no, why bother is the attitude from staff. You know, if they don't care about it at the top, why should we, sort of thing. So having that framework that underpins it is vitally important, but it underpinned again by values and a mission statement, vision statement, that type of thing. Is really core to getting it right.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to make the point that I think your purpose can change. So the denim factory may change their purpose.
Yeah.
Maybe when they've achieved the 400 jobs, what's next? Well, there's a bigger purpose. So, but the core values and the change, your product can change, your services can change, your pricing, positioning. But the core values, if they're really core and they're the right ones, you know, 3 to 5, no more than that, then they should be consistent. There's a great statement. Core values should not be a statement to be abandoned when under pressure, or stress or pressure. No, the opposite. Core values are there to be used when you're under stress and pressure.
Yeah.
And this is nothing to do with core values, or it is. It's personal core values. I listened to someone do a talk 20 years ago. It really stuck with me. He was talking about his dad and how his dad brought him up, and one of the things he said was, when you get home from work, you know, you might be a bit tired, and the kids are there, you know, waiting for you, and you're not sure, you know, maybe not going to be in the best mood. And he said, just ask this question: what would the best dad in the world do when he walked in that door? And you say, oh, right, okay, so let's raise my game with that question. And you could apply that really in a business. What would the best team member, what the best employee do with these core values? What would they do in this situation? Makes it a lot easier to make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I personally have worked in an organisation where the core values were on display on the wall of the office, and you really just as well have had wallpaper, because they were abandoned under the first sign of pressure or stress, or because they weren't living and breathing. I am conscious of time, and we need to get to Bob's section on meetings, but very quickly, I think we all assume and believe that privacy should be one of the core values in every organization. Bob, I mean, interesting for you to say something about this. What would other typical core values look like? You mentioned no more than sort of 4 or 5.
Yeah, well, with privacy, my question for people is, any organization that's got core values defined, is before adding a value, I would say, well, where does privacy sit within the values that you've already got? It probably already is in there. So, like, do the right thing. There's an organization I work for quite closely with. One of their core values is we care, and that applies to lots of areas of the business, but it certainly would apply to data privacy. If you truly care about the customer, right, you'll smile when you serve them, but you'll also look after their credit card details really carefully.
Bob, you've just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly right. Privacy should, as well as other, values, etc., should, sit at the core of all of that. Being transparent and open with the people you deal with. That covers everything, not just privacy. Like you've just said, we care. Treating people's data with respect, but also dealing, with other stuff in the right way. So it's sort of ethical sort of flow running through everything that covers all of those different elements.
Yeah, I always believe if you have that kind of DNA within you of the we care or do the right thing, that every decision you make is much easier and is infinitely more likely to be the right decision for those who are involved by the impact of those decisions, I feel.
Yeah.
I've mentioned my sort of experience of core values done well or badly. I mean, they were kind of a buzzword and used in marketing and on the website of that company, but they were not lived or breathed in any way. And as Bob said earlier, it would have been better that they didn't have them, because the abandonment of those core values sort of said more about the company than anything else. But yeah, I'd be interested in any sort of core values done well or badly. That would be.
I've dealt with organizations that have been sort of on the back end of quite a serious incident or breach, and where they've said, we really don't want to let people know about this. This is really going to affect us in terms of trust, and also, those clients will go elsewhere, sort of thing. So that was for them to make that decision not to tell people about it. It ended up hitting the media anyway, so they looked 100 times worse than what they would have done if they'd been proactive and transparent with the people that were affected. That would have gone a long way, because I would respect an organization more if they were transparent with me, rather than me finding out through the media that something's gone wrong. So
for sure.
So yeah, there's many examples of that type of thing.
There's an accountancy firm I'm thinking about, Richard, there, that one of their values is, they've got about, I think they got 4. They all begin with the word B-E, and one of them is be brave. And that comes out, this is maybe not data privacy, but it comes out in be brave to have conversations, right? And those conversations sometimes are internal conversations that are not comfortable, and also sometimes with clients. So when you have a core value, it can apply, in lots of different situations and really help the business drive through issues that need to be driven through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, both of you. So let's move on then to the power of conversations, sort of neatly segueing into that. Well done, Bob. So in terms of privacy culture and meetings, around 78% of companies fail to transform due to poor engagement with employees. And my take from that is that employee engagement and buy-in is essential for building a privacy culture. And on that basis, effective meetings are a key to that success. Now Bob and I met before today's session to kind of tease out some sort of 5 key areas that Bob would like to focus on in terms of, I'm not going to choose your words, but effective, powerful, meaningful meetings, Bob. And so I'll hand over to you at this point, and for you to sort of talk through these and what they actually mean would be brilliant. Thank you. Yeah,
so in my down-to-earth language, the label that I've given to these is just better meetings. That's what we're about at Agendali, better meetings. And there's sort of 3 elements, I suppose, to a better meeting. One is the process. What happens before the meeting, what happens during the meeting, and what happens after the meeting. So that's the process. You've then got the content, because if you're talking about stuff that doesn't need to be spoken about, or it's boring and uninspiring, or it's not linked to something that's inspiring, then probably the meeting isn't going to be that good. And then you need a host. You need a host of the meeting, like you're doing today, Richard, that can facilitate that conversation. So those are the 3 things to have a better meeting. And meeting culture, I'm not sure if it's on this slide or another one, but what happens in a meeting, if you were just to watch, go into a business, if you want to understand their culture, and you wanted to gauge employee engagement, rather than filling out questionnaires, you just watch what happens in a meeting, because a meeting is literally a window into the culture of that business. So if you've got people not really talking and not contributing, they're probably not engaged. If everyone's there passionate arguing, then And constructive conflict, by the way, is a really good thing, like constructive criticism. They care because they're out, they got their opinions, they're arguing about them. And then the host can say, well, swap opinions and argue against each other. So, you know, adopting the other person's point of view, which is really interesting. So yeah, meeting culture, it's an understanding that meetings matter. Change the word meetings for conversation. That's a really good one, because there's so much negativity around meetings because so many people have attended so many boring meetings that start late, wander off topic, overrun, and don't end with a clear outcome. So meeting culture is really, yeah, it's very closely linked to your business culture. Agendas. So, you know, a lot of people are sending out emails with bullet points or maybe a Word or Google Doc, you know, that looks a bit prettier, but not much more than that. So a really robust agenda will have time topics. We'll have what you'll be thinking about the order of those topics, who's presenting those topics, and really importantly, with an agenda, you need a purpose and outcome statements, 2 separate statements for the meeting and then for each topic, because then you make sure that each topic is supporting the meeting purpose and objective. Very often, you'll see too many topics in a meeting. The wrong sort of people are attending. It all gets a little bit messy. So, and having privacy and data and cyber security on the agenda will ensure that it gets covered. Because if you've got a mixture of things, maybe, you know, many businesses, sales is the dominant thing that we're talking about, or maybe it's an operations-led business, you know, and there's mistakes and there's errors and customer complaints. It can be easy for privacy and other things to sort of be overlooked, forgotten about, or we'll cover that next time. But have these agendas, time topics, and stick to the agenda, run the agenda. Don't have any other business on the agenda. You need pre-work. People need to know why they're coming to the meeting. They need to know what the topics are. They need to know what the content is before they show up. So any other business is an opportunity for people to smuggle in their own personal objectives into a business and completely take it off track. Yeah, pre-work. Pre-work's massive. You know, as a rule of thumb, try to have pre-work on every meeting. Reading something, watching a video, thinking about it. You know, there might be 4 questions to think about before attending the meeting. Making sure that conversation starts at the highest point possible. Meetings are expensive, and very often they're too long. They don't need to be as long as they are. Pre-work can cut the time down and get much more out of a meeting. I mentioned this earlier about stories. Core value stories. Bring in the values to life by talking about, remember what Bernadette did when this situation happened. Just wanted to shout out because Richard last week found himself doing this and did that. That's a brilliant example of we care, or we do the right thing. I'm going to add that to our standard pack of stories that people read when we onboard them, so they know what our values are. Right? They got to learn the words, we care, do the right thing, but they've also got to understand the stories, because that brings things to life. And then the problem solution conversation. Remind me about that one, Richard.
It's something we've talked about previously in terms of, and it's key to successful selling as well, isn't it? And so it's not just about selling, you know, features and tools. You know, and so in terms of data privacy, for instance, you know, the problem and the solution, and then how that leads into to having a conversation about it. And you've obviously mentioned conversations, and some people don't like uncomfortable conversations, do they? But yeah, that would be something I think would be part of the 5, really.
Yeah, with my sales hat on, I sell the problem. I sell the solution. Better meetings. I let people buy the product. I don't never sell the product and the features. I ask questions about it. I'll show them what it does. I want to sell the problem. I want to sell the problem of poor meetings, traditional meetings, average meetings.
And internally speaking, the problem would be data privacy, cybersecurity, And
yeah,
the solution
just
is the staff, really, and supported by culture, isn't it?
Yeah, go back to that story I said, the jeans factory, we've got to get these 400 jobs. This town needs these 400 jobs. There's only one thing that can trip us up, is getting caught on doing something wrong and our brand being destroyed because we haven't looked after people's data. It's really important. It's as important as stitching the jeans and the denim that we buy. We've got to get this sorted. So that's sell the problem, not achieving our goal because of privacy.
Yeah.
What's the solution? Well, a better culture.
And as you said, and I had this ready, meetings are a window into your culture. And I think, and as you said, Bob, people, quite typically might have negative feelings about meetings, but they're such a powerful platform and powerful conversation. So I think what we'll do is I think we've covered these, and there's actually a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to sort of pose to you both. One for you, probably, Meagan. Have you noticed a shift in thinking with organizations that collect personal data, in terms of, are they starting to collect only the data that they actually need, or is it still a trend that organizations feel obliged to collect as much as possible? Are there changes there over the last sort of 5 years?
I'm not sure they intentionally go out to hoover up as much as they can possibly do, although some organizations may still do that. I think the way technology works now, that they are inadvertently capturing probably more than what they need for the purpose. And with the use of AI, etc., you're dealing with organizations that have huge swathes of data about individuals, and trying to narrow that down is quite challenging. But it's always, and what I always say to them, just take a step back and think about what is the purpose of what you're doing, whatever it might be, and then taking it from there. But that's your first sort of juncture, is thinking about what's actually the purpose. What are we trying to achieve? But it is, I think, a technology sort of issue around the amount of data that organizations are landing with, even though they might not necessarily need it for what they're doing. And then getting them to think about retention and deletion is another sort of headache for them as well.
Yeah. I still have the experience as a consumer where I'm asked to provide data that I know isn't really necessary for the purpose of what I'm actually agreeing to, or the relationship between me and the supplier. So I think it's still it's a bit residual, that it's, let's get as much as possible because we might need it. And they don't maybe understand the privacy overhead that comes with that. And a really interesting question also, which is probably too much for us to answer in the time we've got, but I think I'll mention it because it's worth putting it there. This is all great in terms of pre-COVID, when traditionally we worked together in an environment, and how culture was, and how you would build a culture. But how challenging is that when employees are hybrid, or as our team is actually, for the most part, remote? I don't know the answer to that straight away, but I think I know Bob probably has some experience in terms of the meeting concept, because so many meetings are remote and virtual. But
you need more. You need more of them. You need shorter ones, and you need better ones. The onus, what this is, what I think this new work environment is shaking out is weak leadership, poor leadership, ineffective leadership, because you could cover it over with chats over the coffee, it would sort of be resolved. Whereas now you've got to be really clear and much more intentional about whatever it is that you want to move forward, and to keep people engaged. You'll have more meetings, more meetings, and more talking about purpose. Because if you don't do that, it may be that people are feeling sort of left out in the cold. Yeah,
really good point. Really, it's so right, isn't it? Because you don't have that luxury of the casual conversation at the coffee machine, the unintentional smoothing, as you called it there. I think that's really good. So thank you both. That's been fantastic today, as always. Just like to finish up by thanking Bob. Bob's contact details will be on the slide document that goes out, and also the additional questions that people have asked. We will answer and cover them. And I'd like to invite everyone to what we think is possibly one of the most important webinars that we'll host in this series, which is all about why the seasonal festive period is such a difficult and challenging time in terms of cyber crime and cyber attacks. The reason we put this session on when we're putting it on, because We know that in November, December every year, there's a real peak in malicious cyber attacks, because the criminals know that your organization's potentially going to close down, or you might be under more pressure, you might be people on leave, etc. So data breach and cyber attack, 'tis the season to be concerned. That takes place on Thursday, 7th of December at 10 a.m. And I'll be joined by two of my colleagues from within more ClearComm, specifically from within our cybersecurity team. So yeah, it'd be fantastic to see you all on that one. And if you're not, hopefully we'll see you in the new year. Again, many thanks to Meagan and Bob. If you'd like to get in touch with any of us, please do. And we'll see you soon on another webinar. Many thanks.